Olympic athletes have had sports psychology for years. This is just part of the curriculum. They know it. It's just part of their training, just like strength training. But, musicians have never really had this. So when I started working with musicians, started teaching competitive skills, it was like an unfair advantage because the musicians they were going against were all talented and great musicians, but they didn't know how to compete.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath. So glad to have you here today, and visit our site at contrabassconversations.com for the hundreds of interviews we've done spanning all kinds of topics over the past decade plus. I am so excited to bring you today Dr. John Greene, who is a sports psychologist and performance coach who has taught at the World Symphony, Juilliard School, and the Colburn School. And in 2016 alone, Dr. Greene's students won positions with the San Francisco Opera, Montreal Symphony, Pittsburgh Symphony, National Symphony, Cincinnati Symphony, Virginia Symphony, Pacific Northwest Ballet, and the Dance Theatre of Harlem. And if that's not enough, at the 2016 Olympic Games in Rio, his clients won 14 medals, including 5 gold medals. I'm joined on the line today with my longtime collaborator and great friend, John Grillo, who has actually worked with Don in person in the past. And we dig into all kinds of topics, like Don's journey from the world of sports psychology into working with performing artists, the newest research in muscle memory and myelination, negative reinforcement and how it's baked into so much of classical music training, mental rehearsal, visualization, the 5 pillars of centering, and much more. We also dig into his new online course, which is launching in May of 2017. And you can find that at peakperformancetrainingschool.com. Fascinating conversation. So excited to bring this to you today. And before we get rolling, I'd like to thank our sponsor, D'Addario Strings. And I'd encourage you to go to contrabassconversations.com/strings and enter our Kaplan Strings giveaway. D'Addario is giving away 10 sets of Kaplan Strings to Contrabass Conversations listeners. I have been using Kaplans for the last week. I've used a lot of D'Addario Strings in the past. I am loving these Kaplans. They're this buttery, rich, warm sound, great bow response. They're stranded steel core strings. They're clear, warm in all registers. They're beautifully balanced, and they are played by, it's a who's who list of bass players, and it's a lot of past podcast guests. Some of the past podcast guests include Andres Martin, Anthony Stoops, Klaus Freudenstein, Craig Butterfield, Daniel Kimbrough, David Allen Moore. I'm just getting started here. They're wonderful strings, available in light, medium, and heavy tension, made like all D'Addario strings at their New York facilities. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. I'd also like to welcome on board our latest sponsor, the Bass Violin Shop, which offers professional setups, repairs, and restorations at reasonable prices. They go beyond their customers' expectations with meticulously set up basses, friendly and helpful staff, and highly skilled luthiers. And they've got one common goal in mind, which is making their customers happy with whatever bass they happen to play. So whether you have an open seam or you need a top-off restoration, the Bass Violin Shop is there to help you through the process. And they also specialize in resetting necks, repairing cracks, installing new fingerboards, new bass bars, and custom C extensions. Whatever your playing needs, the Bass Violin Shop will work hard to get the most out of your instrument without blowing your budget. Check them out at bassviolinshop.com. And I'd like to thank Rosin Saver, which is a revolutionary storage device that keeps bass rosin feeling as fresh as the day it was made. It's used by members of top orchestras like the New York Philharmonic, the Met Orchestra, Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra, Toronto Symphony, Seattle Symphony, Cleveland Orchestra, and the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And I have a special offer code for you. If you use the promo code HEATH at checkout, you get 10% off any and all orders. That's rosinsaver.com, promo code HEATH. All right, I know you're going to enjoy this conversation with Dr. John Greene. We're on the line with John Grillo, my co-host for the podcast for so many episodes, and Dr. Don Greene, who's a sports psychologist, has worked with the Olympic diving team, worked with Olympic athletes throughout the years, and has worked with countless performing artists. And I'm just so thrilled to have you on the line. Welcome, Don.
Thank you so much. Good to be on.
And John, you've worked with Don over the years, right? Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I worked with Don, I think, in the late 90s, 1997. That's when it was private study. I used to go to his apartment.
But we met at New World.
Yeah, and New World also. Yeah, I mean, it was several times,
right.
But the beginning was private lessons, and then you started doing some master classes at Manhattan School and in Juilliard and stuff.
Right.
And yeah, it's been great, and it's interesting to see how his program has sort of progressed over the years, which we'll get to in a little bit. But Don, I thought it would be really neat to just start with this brief history of where you came from and stuff, from the military training to sports psychology.
Sure. I grew up on Long Island, but I went to high school in Brooklyn because they had a good swimming team. I was a springboard diver and competed all through high school, and then got an athletic appointment to West Point, the military academy, for my diving. When I went there, I was not that competitive a person. I was a diver, and I enjoyed diving, but I wasn't highly competitive in high levels of competition. And what I learned at West Point was the highest level of competition, namely warfare. And although I don't believe in warfare, it really taught me a lot about mental toughness and how to really win, how to dominate in high levels of competition. And throughout my career, I've tried to pass on that knowledge to athletes and then performing artists, musicians, without sending them through all the military training. But I learned a lot there, and then I graduated and went through airborne school, paratrooper training, and ranger school, and then was in the Green Berets. And again, all these military situations taught me a whole lot about, mental toughness and hanging in and focus and, just dominating in high levels of competition. And again, that's something I've just always tried to pass on to the people I've worked with. I got out of the Army in 1975. By then, I'd got my master's degree. I eventually wound up moving to San Diego and took a vacation, which I hadn't taken since I was in high school, and started playing a lot of beach volleyball, like nonstop, all day, every day, beach volleyball. And my partner was an older guy. He had his PhD in psychic self-regulation, which is controlling internal body states, that he got in, I think in Russia. But he was a professor at UCSD in San Diego, and he was a pretty good volleyball player. And he and I were playing several matches, and we got beat by these other two guys. No big thing, but we sat down to watch these guys that beat us. And this ball came to one of those guys, and he missed it. He just flat out missed it. And I turned to my partner, Dr. Al, and I said, Al, did you see what happened there? He said, yeah. I said, did you see that guy miss? He said, yeah. I said, do you know why he missed? He says, oh, yeah. I said, well, tell me, because I want to know. He says, hold on. So we're both living next door to each other on the beach, and he went up to his apartment, and he came down with a book, and he said, read this. So I was not a very good reader in West Point, but this book all of a sudden was very fascinating to me, and I read it. In fact, I stayed up all night. I was so fascinated by it. I'd never read a book like that. I went back to him the next day. I said, this is really interesting information about focus and concentration. I said, I want to talk to you. I have a lot of questions. He said, hold on. And he went up and got another book, and he said, here, read this. So I stayed up all night reading that, and had all the answers I was looking for as a competitive athlete, because although I was well trained and could be very good, I was also erratic, and I could hit really challenging, tough dives, back 1.5 with 2.5 twists, and then miss a front dive. And I was always curious about why I was erratic as a diver. And here was a guy I thought had the answer to this. So I read that night all the way through, and I went back the next day. I never read 2 books like that in my life. Went back the next day. I said, I need to talk to you. I've got a million questions. I think you have the answers. And he said, stop. He got another book. Well, we did this for like a week and a half. And it was like getting a master's degree in sports psychology. all I wanted to do was read more books about this and try to really understand it, and also write it into a book, because this was the book as an athlete I'd always been looking for, asking questions about. Nobody had the answers. None of my coaches could explain it to me. And here I was getting the answers. So I wound up moving away from the beach so I could write more and study more and understand more. And I did that until I ran out of money. And I had to take a job as a assistant PE teacher at a grammar school. And all I did was continue to read, and I started teaching the kids the ideas I was learning about focus and controlling your mind and paying attention, things like that. And the kids were open to it. So I continued writing, and to make a long story short, I wound up starting a PhD program in sports psychology. And it was a 4-year program, and I had the best professors in the country at the school, and I just loved every minute of it. And I wound up doing my dissertation with the San Diego Police SWAT team using the centering strategy. This is one of the main strategies I teach people. And I set up a study where some of the SWAT officers learned how to center, learned the centering strategy, and some didn't. And then we sent them through a move and shoot course where targets would pop up. They'd have to shoot pairs of targets. They'd have to shoot the bad guy holding the machine gun, not the woman with the groceries, and move through this course and engage the targets. And as a result of the research, the officers that centered before they went through the course performed significantly better on a stress shooting. It was the first time SWAT officers had ever been studied or shown effective ways to help them perform better under extreme stress. And it got a lot of notoriety. In fact, it went out on the wire services, and the FBI SWAT team in Quantico, Virginia got it, and they asked me to come back and train their SWAT team, which I thought was very nice. But at the same time, my advisor on my dissertation, Robert Nideffer, the man who invented centering, was working with the Olympic track and field team and the Olympic diving team. The Olympic track team is very big, not the diving team, but he couldn't do both. And he asked me if I'd like to work with the Olympic diving team with Ron O'Brien. And it's like a dream come true. Not as a coach, but as a sports psychologist. And this was a team that had just 21 elite divers and the world's best diving coach, who would have been my dream diving coach. He was at Ohio State if I was a better diver, but I wasn't that good. But here I am working with my dream coach and his 21 divers before the games. It was just a fantastic experience. My mentor, Nideffer, had taught all the divers before I got there to center. And so, Luganis and Wendy Weiland and Michelle Mitchell all learned it from Bob Nideffer and were training it by the time I got there. And I started working with the team, and 2 months later we went to the Olympic trials, and Michelle Mitchell came in first on the platform, Wendy Weiland came in second on the platform, and Greg Louganis came in first on the springboard and platform. And we went to the Olympic Games in LA, and Michelle Mitchell won a silver, Wendy Weiland won a bronze, and Greg won 2 golds and set an all-time Olympic record in the platform. And that was basically the beginning of my career as a sports psychologist. Very few people ever become sports psychologists, and I was barely out of school, and I was with the Olympic champion divers. It was wonderful. So after the Olympics, a real estate developer in Florida who had watched the Olympics was very frustrated because he didn't feel that we were supporting our athletes financially. This is way back in the amateur days, that a lot of the other countries we were competing against supported their athletes, and others had to fend on their own. So he basically went to the Olympic swimming coach and the Olympic diving coach and said, if you bring your athletes to South Florida, to Boca Raton, I'll build your ideal pools, your dream pools. So they said, yes, we're interested in that, and can we bring our staff, namely the assistant coaches and myself, as a sports psychologist for both teams? And they said yes. So I moved to South Florida in 1985, I believe, 1984, and to work with the swimmers and divers. To make a long story short, they started building this incredibly, probably the best swimming and diving facility in the world, but we ran into incredible cost overruns and delays. And they basically said to the assistant coaches and myself that we have to go out and earn our keep until the pool was done, until we could be functional. And to make a long story short, I started working with professional golfers and professional race car drivers until the pool was done. By the time the pool was done, I was working, teaching for Golf Digest schools and working almost full-time with this race car driver, a Grand Prix style driver in Florida through 1988. But in 1986 or 87, I was at Fort Lauderdale with the platform divers, and a opera coach from Miami and conductor came to see me on the pool deck, and he said he'd heard about me and my work, and was I interested in working with two opera singers? And I thought, not really. I love music. I've always loved music, but I've avoided opera all my life. I thought that's not, anyway. So he said, okay. I said, yeah, okay. Let me meet them. And they came to the pool, and you have to see, from my point of view, here I am standing on the deck watching these women do really hard and very dangerous dives at the 10-meter platform, where two people have killed themselves on the platform. And here come these opera singers, and they were like scared to death of even meeting me. And they had more anxiety than any two women I think I've ever met. And I thought, what's the big deal? You sing. Just try diving off a 10-meter platform. That's scary.
A lot of truth to that. That's right.
Yeah, no kidding.
So I started working with these women, teaching basically sports psychology and controlling anxiety and energy and channeling it. And they were getting it, and it was going very well. And then I went and participated in some coachings with the conductor. And the first time I ever stood next to an opera singer when they really, hit a high note, it was like, it blew me away. It was, I'd never heard anything like it, let alone stand next to it. And the power of it just blew me away. And I thought, how do you do that? And I started to become fascinated with the opera voice. It was like an athletic event. It was like the javelin to me. How do you do that? And it sounded good to me. So we kept on working. And they had, when they originally started with me, both of them wanted to back out of their roles and have somebody else do it. They just were scared to death. So a week before, they said, we're going to do it. We're doing well. And here's the ticket. We want you to come. And I said, oh, no. If I knew that was going to happen, I wouldn't have worked with you in the first place. And they said, and you have to wear a certain tie. And I thought, that does not, no way. I thought, okay. But I hope none of my Green Beret buddies see me going in. I mean, just that would, anyway. So I went, and it was Bohème. And I was absolutely blown away. I never heard anything like it. I was crying like a baby. Why have I deprived myself of this? This is beautiful. And in one instant, I fell in love with opera. Just fell in love. Couldn't get enough of it. So went backstage and hugs, and the conductor was thrilled, and the two singers were ecstatic. And I thought, I want more of this. So I didn't get that right away. I wound up moving to Northern California to complete a study with my mentor. It was Dr. Bruce Ogilvie, the man who basically founded sports psychology, modern sports psychology. He was the one in the early 60s to start working with the Dallas Cowboys, the Portland Trail Blazers, and Major League Baseball teams, but they had to sneak him in the back because nobody wanted to shrink in there. But he was the one that opened up professional sports to sports psychology. And he was one of my mentors in school. And after he and I had started a research project on how athletes learn and how they compete, these were inventories. We started research on athletes using these two questionnaires to profile their strengths and weaknesses. And after 2 years of working apart, we figured we needed to get together to really complete it. So we started with massive testing to get these to be proven statistically correct instruments. And we did a study of 1,000 athletes, a lot of athletes in the Bay Area, from Stanford, from Cal Berkeley, from Santa Clara University. And we did great research, but we didn't get the statistical significance on the numbers that we needed. So we had to do another study, which we did with another 1,500 athletes. And again, we came close, but we didn't get it. We had to do a third study, and finally we got the numbers. By then we had tested 4,800 athletes, and we now had the best instruments for measuring athletes' tendencies, learning tendencies and performance tendencies, called Learning Styles Inventory and the Competitive Styles Inventory. I'll come back to this later because my current inventories, all of them are based on these. So I started at this time, I got calls from two people who had heard about me and wanted me to work with them with auditions. One was a horn player who was with Syracuse, and although he had gotten to Syracuse years ago, he was stuck there, and he had failed his last 45 auditions in a row. He couldn't get out of the prelims, and he wanted to get the job in Houston Symphony, and he asked for my help. And at the same time, I met this mezzo-soprano from New York who had an audition for the Chicago Lyric Opera coming up in 2 months, and she wanted my help, but she didn't audition well either. I said to these people I'd help them prepare for the audition. I wouldn't charge them if I could tape our phone conversations because it's all done on the phone. So I worked with each of them for 2 months, once a week for 2 months, taped it, and then they each won their auditions. And that's when I had the tapes transcribed, and that was basically put into my first book, Audition Success. Because of that, a lot of people had heard about me, and a couple of years later, I got a call from Julie Landsman, who is on the faculty at Juilliard. She told me that there was a Met audition coming up, Met opera audition for horn, and she wanted me to work with 4 of her students. And again, we had about 2 months. I went to New York. I met with each of the women. Once I tested them all, gave them the feedback on the profiles, came up with a plan for each of them for the audition. I think 250 people had sent in recordings. I think the Met accepted 59 people to play the audition. And of those people, the 4 people I worked with came in first, second, fourth, and fifth. The girl who came in first was a Juilliard graduate. She went to President Polisi and told him about our work. The girl who came in second was a junior at Juilliard. She played so well that they gave her a $100,000 subcontract. She also went to Joseph Polisi and told him about me. And before long, Joseph and I were talking, and he invited me to start teaching at Juilliard. A little bit after that, 2 women at New World Symphony had heard about this and went to Dean Patnott, told her about me, and basically in 97 asked me to come down to present to all the fellows at the New World Symphony. And the dean said basically this was my audition. If the fellows want it, I've got a job. If they don't want it, thanks for coming. So I did probably an hour-and-a-half lecture, and it was unanimous. All the fellows wanted it. So that's when I started, teaching there, probably once or twice a year, as well as Juilliard, and also started teaching at other schools like, Manhattan School and Manus and Oberlin. What happened was I was loving teaching at Juilliard. I was working with, many more musicians than athletes at this point, and I was very happy. I'd had a great career working with, professional Olympic athletes, done everything I'd ever wanted to do as a sports psychologist, and now I was actually happier working with performing artists, teaching them the same skills that professional athletes and Olympic athletes had learned. And I was in heaven. At about this time, well, a little bit before this time, I also started working on Wall Street for Merrill Lynch, basically teaching them how to perform better under pressure and how to make better decisions under pressure. And I did that for about a year until 9/11. And when 9/11 hit, they asked me to work full-time, 24/7, doing grief counseling and disaster management, which I did for several months until they said they were done with grief management and they let me go. And I moved to Hawaii for 2 years. It took me about 6 months to recover, but after about 6 months, I got bored, so I started working with members of the Honolulu Symphony, started teaching at the Punahou School, and did that for a couple of years until I really felt like I was not on purpose and that I really missed working with artists intensely in New York and Juilliard. And I called Joseph Polisi up and I said, I've been thinking about coming back. And he said, we'd love to have you back. And I started crying and I thought, yeah, I got to go back. So I went back to New York for 2 years, resumed at Juilliard and loved it more than ever for 2 years until I couldn't stand New York anymore. I grew up there and it's a love and hate relationship. I can take it for so long, but I had enough. I moved to Phoenix for 2 years to work with professional athletes, professional golfers again for 2 years until I had enough of the hot sun and wanted to be back in San Diego. Moved back to San Diego, spent a year writing a book on peak performance psychology, and then started working at the Olympic Training Center in San Diego with track and field athletes, high jumpers, shot putters, javelin throwers, and did that up to and through the Rio Games, where 14 of them won medals and 5 of them won gold medals. And about the same time, I was invited to come up to Los Angeles to do a seminar for pop singers, a 2-week seminar. Not classical singers, but pop singers, rock and roll, which I'd never done in my career. And at first I was pretty interested, and some of the people were fairly famous, Grammy Award winners and all. And I started work with them, but what I saw was that they were not very disciplined, not very dedicated, and the more I worked with them, the more I missed working with classical musicians and the dedication and the practice habits, and it was totally absent in these rock stars. So I stopped working with them and started teaching at the Colburn School in downtown LA. And it was back to classical musicians, and it seemed very similar to Juilliard to me, and I was loving it again. And I did that for 2 years. I got somewhat frustrated with the administration, and that's when I thought I should start my own online school to teach the same things I taught at Juilliard and Colburn and New World, but through my own online school to make it available to artists throughout the world. So I basically spent the last year working on this online school, doing a new assessment, a new profile, a new workbook, new audios on censoring, new videos on censoring, PDFs, and I've been working on it for a year and a half. It was supposed to be done 6 months ago, and it should be opening soon in May.
There's so many directions I'd love to go in terms of your story. Like the last thing somebody would probably expect, looking at prior to your working with artists, is that you would go from working, with SWAT team and with Olympic athletes to artists. I love to maybe just what are some of the key maybe similarities and differences between working with athletes and working with these classical musicians?
Well, if you take working with Olympic athletes and classical musicians, these people are obviously very talented, but it's more than talent, because there's a lot of talented people. These are the people who are dedicated, who are constantly striving, who are trying to do everything they can to be their best. That's the similarity. The difference is that athletes, thanks to my mentor long ago, Olympic athletes have had sports psychology for years. This is just part of the curriculum. They know it. They could teach musicians about this. It's just part of what they're training, just like strength training. But musicians have never really had this. I was probably one of the first ones back in Juilliard, certainly with New World, to start talking about mental training, to teach them the same things that athletes knew and did well in competition, but athletes didn't know. So when I started working with musicians, started teaching competitive skills, it was like an unfair advantage because the musicians they were going against were all talented and great musicians, but they didn't know how to compete. So that, in an orchestral situation, they could play very well, but in an audition, which is not necessarily making music, it's competition, they didn't know how to do that. And I found them very much wanting to learn and very motivated to learn, and probably better students than some of my athletes who sometimes took it for granted.
Yeah, it's just not in the system. Isn't it amazing that you go to all, like when you first came to this, you went to all these schools. I remember you telling me this once, where you were kind of astounded at the lack of sort of the attention on mental training. And
I still am.
Yeah.
It's still only in a couple of schools in the world.
And then don't they say, like, how public speaking, don't they say isn't public speaking the most fearful thing someone can do?
Yeah, and the number one fear in the United States is public speaking. The number two is death or death of a spouse. The joke is people would rather, at a funeral, they'd rather be in the coffin than have to give the eulogy.
That's right.
Yeah, that's the number one. But what I didn't mention is the way I came to this was, in spite of my military background and diving, public speaking was the worst fear of my life. I couldn't do it. All through high school, all through college, I choked. My senior year at West Point, I had to give a 5-minute presentation on revolutionary warfare and Che Guevara, which was my major. And I knew it cold. And for a week beforehand, I couldn't sleep. And these are the guys I went through West Point with, my best buddies, 15 of them sitting around me, wanting me to do my best. I got up there, and I absolutely blanked out. I stuttered, my face got flush, I was shaking, and it was embarrassing. It was terrible. Somehow, I still passed. But fast forward years, and I'm thinking about going to law school, and I thought, I've got to get past this fear. So I went to Toastmasters. And you sit around a conference table with a brown bag lunch, and all you have to say is your name, where you're from. So I'm sitting there, and they're going around saying, my name's so-and-so, my name's so-and-so. And before they got to me, I left. I couldn't deal with it. I'd rather jump out of a plane than say my name in front of a group of people. So to make a long story short, I started my graduate program in sports psychology, and I learned how to center. That was it. I learned how to center. And all of a sudden, I could talk in front of people. And fast forward, now I love it. I've been a keynote speaker at MTNA and a bunch of musical conferences and Olympic coaches. And I absolutely love speaking in public, but I learned how to do it. But the thing that's harder than speaking in public is playing a classical instrument in public. And the reason why I have a great respect and I love working with musicians is because it's a lot tougher than talking. Not to mention, instruments like double reeds and opera. And that's why I love working with musicians and have such great respect for them.
Or French horn too. I think they could actually be.
Well, that too. French horn's been very good to me. I basically started with that and built my career on it. And it wasn't until much later that I realized, where French horn fit and the challenge of the instrument.
But what's interesting is that in sports, there's always a balance between critique and like motivation. Your coach will come up, they'll tear you a new one, but then there's always kind of a pat on the back and say, okay, let's go. All right. But see, in classical music, we grow up where you're like always wrong. It's one of the hardest things. Me and Jason talk about this a lot. Like when you teach in a lesson, you play for a teacher. Oh, you have to do this. It's like, you go to rehearsal, the conductor's yelling at you, and this just builds up over time,
Yeah, that's true.
And you get to the professional level, and it's so much negativity. I mean, I was 19 when I played with a Big Five orchestra, and I was like, I couldn't believe the sea of negativity. It's just like insane. That's a whole other topic.
Yeah, but we've come a long way in sports, but there are still a lot of take a sport like football. There's still a lot of screaming coaches in football. A lot of negative reinforcement. There's a split nowadays. Some are more progressive, enlightened coaches. but there's still some old-time football coaches and baseball coaches that are still negative reinforcers, and it's a shame. It's fortunately going away, but it's still there as well. I just see it with classical musicians. It's just so much more precise than, gross motor skills like swimming the butterfly. It's so precise, and it needs to be correctly on pitch and time and all of that. And that's why there's so much nitpicking. Unfortunately, there's too much emphasis on the negative nitpicking and not on enough positive reinforcement of you doing that well.
I never forget, I read in the famous conductor, George Schulte's book. He said he always tried to balance, every critique with sort of, just a positive comment. I never forgot that.
Well, there it is. It's, the rule of positive, negative, positive. That's classical in teaching and coaching. I'm not sure it's prevalent with music teachers.
And that would be cool. Could you talk about some of that new research you were doing and the TED video? I found that fascinating. Because some of the stuff you learn in there, I think, would have such an amazing impact on musicians of stuff about muscle memory, the rethinking muscle memory.
Oh, yeah. It's absolutely fascinating stuff. All the research about muscle memory, it's the latest, greatest, because there's no such thing as muscle memory. It's all based on myelin, M-Y-E-L-I-N, myelin, in the central nervous system, and it's a connection of the myelin sheath and around the axons and the nerve impulses from the brain to the muscles traveling through these neural pathways. And the more we repeat a physical action like bowing on a bass, the more we're building the myelin sheath around the axon chains that send the impulses to the muscles. But the muscles don't have any memory. They're just muscles. They just fire or relax. So the true intelligence, the muscle memory, is really in the central nervous system through the myelination of the axons. And this is the latest scientific research there is. Until recently, they could only do the research on animals or cadavers, but they came up with a new method to measure myelin based upon the weight of the water around the sheath. And now they can measure it and measure the number of correct repetitions you do. The more you build the myelin, the more it becomes an automatic habit, namely done without conscious thinking. And that's the key. That's the reason for the repetition, because they now understand the mechanism by which athletes and musicians choke. And it's very intricate, but it's all built upon the concept of myelin. Because if the myelin is sufficiently built, you can trust it under pressure and let it happen without the conscious thinking of telling yourself what to do. But what happens under extreme pressure with trained people who are expected to do well, if they start doubting themselves or start overreacting to the fear, they start overriding the myelin. Instead of trusting it, they start thinking. They start thinking in the prefrontal cortex, namely the front part of our thinking brain, and the function of executive thinking. This is thinking in terms of planning, left brain thinking in terms of words, instructions, contingency planning. This is the last thing you want to do in the middle of a concert when it should be automatic. What happens when the prefrontal cortex overrides the muscle memory or the connections, the neural pathways, is that people start overthinking. And then instead of doing it with a flowing motion, without the thinking, they start having to think their way through it. And that's when they revert from playing like a professional musician to playing like a fifth grader, when they had to think their way through it, and it sounds like a fifth grader. And they hear it, everybody else hears it, and then they think even more how to get out of this. And this is all based upon finally understanding myelin, the myelination process, how practice affects myelin, and how myelin, if trusted, can prevent people from choking. That's the latest research, and it's absolutely fascinating, and not that many people know about it yet.
Well, Don, I remember you always said that goes also with mental rehearsal, where, I mean, the mind can't tell the difference between visualization and actually doing it in physical context.
That's true. When mental rehearsal or visualization is done correctly, The subconscious mind, where our confidence resides, cannot distinguish between reality and something vividly imagined, especially if it's vividly imagined repeatedly.
Because I never forgot the story you said. I forgot the guy's name, but it was one of the gymnasts you said. I think it was on the bar or the vault, where he only did mental rehearsal and then did it in the Olympics and got a 10, and he never did it once in physical practice.
Well, that's close. His name was Bart Conner. It was back in the 80s, and he was going to do what's called a flyaway on the high bar, where they would do several giant swings around the high bar, then let go of the bar, do a flip, and then catch the bar and do another giant swing. And nobody had ever tried it before. There was no way to really prepare for it physically, and you couldn't use usual spotting rigs, to wrap around your waist that if you got in trouble, you could hoist you up from the ceiling. You couldn't do it because it had to be set up with multiple swings. So evidently, reporters had heard that Bart Conner was going to try this trick for the first time in practice, and they all went out to videotape it. And they did, and the first time he did it, he absolutely nailed it, maybe 9.5 or 10. And they couldn't believe it. And they said, well, this was a ruse. You've probably been practicing this for months. You just wanted to show off. He says, well, I have been practicing it for many months, thousands of times in my head. And this is just the first time I really did it physically. But I'm not surprised. This is how I've been doing it for months. And that, to me, is, the power of mental rehearsal or visualization. I could give you countless other examples, but it just works as effectively for musicians because you can only practice so much. And especially like with brass players that before auditions tend to overplay and blow out their chops. This is a much better way to prepare, especially in the last few weeks before auditions. Because if you play through audition excerpts this over and over and over, you're going to hit some, you're going to make some mistakes. Every mistake you make registers in your subconscious, knocks down your confidence. Plus, it causes fatigue or, wearing out your muscles. So especially the last week or two before auditions, I'm really a big fan of tapering, namely backing off of physical training like athletes know how to do and do more mental rehearsal and more training. Because when you do mental rehearsal right, you should hit it every time. And then you go into the audition with the memory of you've been nailing it. Just do it again. So I think it's just as effective for performing artists as it is for competitive athletes.
Okay, Don, let's start talking about your new online training school. The website's peakperformancetrainingschool.com. And I would love to hear about your five categories plus the skills tests.
Sure. Well, as part of this new online school, I came up with a new assessment designed exactly for this and performing artists. It's called the Performance Mastery Assessment. It measures performance mastery in 5 key areas. So you take this questionnaire online, and you immediately get a performance profile, the Performance Mastery Profile, which outlines strengths and weaknesses in 5 key areas related to performing your best under pressure as a performing artist. So the main factors are energy regulation, confidence, courage, focus, and resilience. The questionnaire asks specific questions about these areas, and as soon as you finish it, you get a profile detailing strengths and weaknesses in these 5 areas. After you understand what the scores mean, then you can start working on the weakest areas. In other words, for energy regulation, learning how to both lower anxiety and also how to raise it. Sometimes low energy is good, sometimes higher energy is good, but energy varies. It rarely stays the same. And through the centering process, people can learn how to both lower their anxiety or actually raise their energy. The idea is to control and channel that nervous energy or that anxiety into better performance because it takes energy and sometimes a lot of high positive energy to be your best, not just being mellow and relaxed. The second factor, confidence, has to do with raising your confidence level. There's 3 ways basically to raise your confidence level. One is through good practice habits of doing the right things. The second is through the quality of your self-talk, whether it's negative or positive. Negative self-talk will lower confidence. Positive self-talk will raise it. The next one having to do with confidence has to do with whether you're pessimistic or optimistic? Are you seeing the glass half empty or half full? Half full or more is better for confidence. And the third one is mental rehearsal, of being able to vividly imagine yourself doing well. The better you're able to see yourself doing well, the more you'll believe it, the more your confidence will increase. The third has to do with courage and building courage, because it takes courage to play classical instruments under pressure. Rather than going with the path of fear, the idea is to understand what your fears are and then learn ways to get past them by building courage. This is a main priority for many performing artists versus anxiety. The next thing has to do with focus and intensifying focus, whether that's getting past distractions, learning how to get in the zone, learning how to stay there longer. Focus is a key element of performing under pressure. You lose your focus, you make a mistake. Make enough mistakes, you lose the job. So focus is something that is not that well understood, nor ways to increase one's focus, but there are definite ways, this is what I teach, of how to intensify your focus under extreme pressure. The final factor is resilience. That's the ability to bounce back from setbacks or mistakes. And this involves mental toughness training, recovery from mistakes, taking responsibilities for your actions, and becoming resilient, bouncing back no matter what. So those are the 5 main areas that we work on improving, but it starts with an assessment. What do they need to work on first? Or what are the areas where they can make the most improvements in the least amount of time? And that's what the online program is about, of teaching these skills, which are learned skills.
Okay, Don, that sounds awesome. Could you tell us, so if someone wants to take your class, could you just walk us through the steps of what the options are?
So if you go to peakperformancetrainingschool.com and look for the Performance Mastery course, that's where you'll find it. You'll get up-to-date information about the course and the early bird pricing. The course will start on May 15th. You can get on right now and add your name to the wait list to get more information and about the schedule and the content of the course. But there's 3 basic levels. The first is the self-study course. That involves the performance mastery assessment, the profile, the centering audios and videos, the workbook, and PDFs. That can be done over a 2-month period of time at one's own pace. The second is a VIP program where they get all the basic features of the self-study, but they get once a week, 1-hour office hours, where I'm online and they can ask questions, make comments, or I can give further instructions. That's the VIP level. And the third one is the executive VIP, which is for only 10 students on a limited basis. But in addition to getting the other features from the other 2 programs, we have one-on-one live sessions once a week through phone or Skype sessions with me. Those are the 3 parts. They each last for 2 months with a 1-month extension to continue learning the materials. But this is the program of the Peak Performance Training School, and the specific program is the Performance Mastery course. If they go to my website, they can look at it, they can understand it better, get more information, and get on the wait list. I'd also encourage them to look at the TED Talk, and they can find out also on the Peak Performance Training School or on YouTube or on TED. So far, we've gotten over 13 million views of the TED Ed presentation.
Well, Don, this is so exciting to see, and I just love that you've put this into an online course so that anyone in the world can get this training with you and benefit from what you've done. And I know John's worked with you in person. I haven't, but I have benefited just so much from what you've done in the past. So I just want to thank you. And I keep a list of things that come up on the podcast, and you are one of the most frequently referenced people out of all the hundreds of interviews I've done. So it's just like it's such an honor to have you on the show and chat with you and John. And folks, definitely check out peakperformancetrainingschool.com. And thanks, Don, for everything you're doing.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Jason. Can I say one other thing?
Oh, please. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, as part of this, I formed the Peak Performance Training Forum. And this is for performing artists to either make comments, make postings, ask questions, or share information. And I'd really encourage people to go to this, look at it and hopefully sign up and be a part of it. It's all complimentary, and we're sharing a lot of great ideas amongst performing artists, and that's what I'm hoping to do is start to create a dialogue, not just from myself, but amongst performing artists like yourself that have this information, that have their own experience of it, which I think is probably more valuable than mine. So I'd encourage everybody to check this out. Peak Performance Training Forum. Jason, I have one question for you.
Yeah, please.
I've been waiting to ask this. So thank you. You've been through a lot of my material, and hopefully you've converted it through your knowledge and experience as a trained musician. And what do you think you found to be most helpful for my information for people taking auditions?
Yeah. So I think there is life before I discovered the concept of centering that you described in your various books, and then there's life after that for me. Just the developing the ability to center. It was something I had never even really thought about, and it just totally changed the way I perform. It changed my level of confidence. It changed the way I taught, and that was such a game changer for me.
Wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. One of the things that's happened to me is because of my journey, as I explained, of, being at Juilliard and then after 9/11 being out of it and then back to Juilliard and then going to Phoenix and then taking a year to write a book. I pretty much got out of the mainstream and lost touch with a lot of friends and colleagues and students. And now by sending out this information and, opening up, I'm getting a lot of wonderful response, like from John Grillo, of people that I haven't heard from for years who, it's great to be back in touch. And I'm finding some of these people are in major teaching positions, like at the San Francisco Conservatory, Peabody, Curtis, Juilliard, and some of the people I knew at New World Symphony are in principal positions in major orchestras. And I'm kind of getting back in touch with them again. And it's just been kind of a wonderful reunion with some wonderful people.
Well, Don, thank you so much for chatting today. It's just so great to catch up with you here. And I know that your message, it's helped so many people, and definitely check out peakperformancetrainingschool.com. And John, thanks again for chatting. I love co-hosting these with you, and I really appreciate it.
No, Jason, no, thanks so much. It's awesome. And I think one of the best aspects of doing these podcasts is reconnecting with old friends and teachers and mentors. And Don, just thanks for, agreeing to do this. And it's just awesome to talk to you and just email and just be back in touch. It's great.
Well, thank you, John. And my pleasure. And Jason, thank you so much. It's been delightful. All the best.
Don, thank you so much for talking. And John, thanks again for co-hosting. We've done so many of these together. It's always a blast. Folks, peakperformancetrainingschool.com is the site. Check it out. And while you're there, watch that TED Ed video that we were talking about during the interview. It's fascinating. It'll change the way you think about practice, performance, training. So interesting. Thanks again for tuning into this podcast. I know there are lots of ways you could be spending your time, and I'm so thankful that you're taking your time to listen to this, and I really hope you get something out of it. I appreciate it. I know John appreciates it. I know Don appreciates it. And I love hearing from people that listen to this show. If you'd ever like to get in touch, feedback@contrabassconversations.com is a great way to do it. I respond to each and every email, and I get almost every single idea for the show from people that listen. Guest ideas, topic ideas, that sort of thing. It's really a community show. Thank you so much for tuning in, whether this is your first episode or your 339th episode. I really appreciate it. And we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.